Paul Ryan has been getting such bad press in the last few days that you might expect him to say, take this job and shove it. But wait, he actually already said that in April when he announced that he would be stepping down from Congress at the end of the year, giving up the House speakership. And so you thought that he might sort of play out the string, as a guy who actually never particularly wanted this job. You'll recall he was drafted by his fellow House Republicans in 2015 because John Boehner said, take this job and shove it, and he got fed up with being Speaker. But it really is a mission impossible to be in charge of the House Republican caucus, and even though he's in his last 7 or 8 months, Ryan is still having a tough time. So you look at the headlines, just front page stories in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Post says Ryan is losing his grip on the feuding House Republican conference just months before the pivotal midterm elections. The New York Times says with the Republicans in revolt on both his right and his left, Mr. Ryan is increasingly facing questions about whether he can manage to stumble across the finish line. And just for good measure, Politico says as the Republican conference spirals into an all-out war, that could put his speakership on the line. Now, I think there's a little bit of media hype here in the sense that, as some of the stories acknowledge, he's probably not going to lose his job. He's probably not going to have to give up being Speaker prematurely, but he is clearly not having a whole lot of fun. So what's happening is, first, you had this sort of odd spectacle last week of the House Republicans couldn't even pass a farm bill. It used to be something you would do, just like walking and chewing gum. And yet it got tangled up with the immigration issue and had to be pulled off the floor. Now you have a group of Republican moderates who've signed what's called the discharge petition, and according to legislative procedure, it's a real finger in the eye to the leadership. If they get enough signatures, which they don't yet, they could force a floor vote on immigration legislation. Now, Ryan once wanted to have an immigration compromise, but he doesn't want anything to do with it with the midterm elections coming up and the party so far apart on DACA, border security, and all of that. So that hasn't helped. And then you had this weird spectacle reported by the Weekly Standard where White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney said publicly, I've talked to Kevin McCarthy, the House's number 2. Maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea to force a leadership election, and that would make the Democrats, particularly those in sort of marginal districts, have to vote for Nancy Pelosi, and we could use that against them, except that would mean that they'd be forcing a vote on a new speaker. McCarthy is widely viewed as the guy who will succeed Paul Ryan, but if all went according to plan, that would be next January after the midterms. Now, the reason all of this is of more than passing interest, of course, is the Democrats have a real shot at taking over the House. There was a lot of grumbling when Ryan announced his retirement so early in the year that, essentially he'd be a lame duck for a long period of time. That would hurt fundraising and things like that. I think that it's not a situation where there's a big legislative agenda to be pushed. And you have to say, if you look at Paul Ryan's tenure, he's had a lot of difficulties with President Trump. They did succeed in passing the major tax cut legislation, but on other major big ticket items, repealing Obamacare, anything on immigration, it's a big zero. But certainly it's kind of typical for Washington that you don't push a lot of major legislation in the 5 or 6 or 7 months before the voters go to the polls in the midterm. So there's, while they have to, fund the government and keep it going and do things like that, I'm not expecting the House or the Senate to do much of anything. So Paul Ryan, I guess you could say, he potentially could lose his job if things go wrong. I think the fight would be so bloody to replace him. The Republicans will not want that to happen in the middle of the midterms. But man, he looks like a guy who's ready to go home.